In 1978, the Nevada Gaming Control Board added a name to its Black Book. The Black Book is the official name for Nevada's list of excluded persons, a register of individuals whose criminal histories are considered so serious that they are permanently banned from setting foot inside any licensed casino in the state. Getting into the Black Book is not easy. Nevada does not add names casually. The list had been created in 1960, initially with 11 names. By the late 1970s, after nearly 2 decades of additions, the total still numbered fewer than 20 people. The state reserved it for organized crime figures of demonstrated significance, not peripheral associates or minor criminals. Nick Civella made the list, and then, from his home in Kansas City, Missouri, never setting foot in Nevada again for the rest of his life, Nick Civella continued to run skimming operations at the Tropicana Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. The FBI eventually documented what he was doing. Federal prosecutors eventually charged him for it. A jury eventually convicted him. He died of cancer in March 1983 while under house arrest awaiting sentencing, still the boss of the Kansas City crime family, having never actually seen the inside of the building he was stealing from. Casino, the 1995 Martin Scorsese film based on the Frank Rosenthal story and its connection to the Kansas City and Chicago mobs, treats Kansas City as a supporting character in a story it frames primarily around Las Vegas. The Chicago outfit gets the narrative weight. The Las Vegas operators get the screen time. Kansas City appears as a group of men in suits who receive envelopes and argue about money. The real Nick Civella was never a supporting character in anything. He ran one of the most profitable criminal operations in American history from a city that Las Vegas never took seriously enough to watch closely, and that oversight cost Nevada's casinos millions of dollars across nearly a decade. This is the real Nick Civella. Kansas City was never the minor league. The standard story of organized crime in mid-20th century America places the power centers on the coasts and in Chicago. New York's 5 families, Chicago's outfit, the Philadelphia mob. Kansas City gets mentioned as a flyover city with a small mob that punched above its weight because of its geography. This framing understates what Kansas City actually was and what Nick Civella built inside it. The Kansas City crime family had roots going back to the 1910s and 1920s, when the city's position as a railroad hub and a center for meatpacking and grain made it genuinely important to the national economy. The illegal economy that grew alongside the legitimate one reflected the city's actual commercial weight. Kansas City was not a satellite of Chicago or New York. It was an independent operation with its own territory, its own income streams, and its own relationships with the national mob structure that were conducted as peer relationships rather than tributary ones. Nick Civella was born in 1912 in Kansas City into the Italian-American community that had been building organized crime infrastructure in the city for decades. His rise through the organization followed a path that will be familiar from other mob histories. He learned the business from men who had built it, demonstrated the specific combination of operational capability and interpersonal authority that leadership in these organizations required, and by the early 1950s had emerged as the boss of the Kansas City family. He held that position for 30 years. 30 years is a long tenure for any mob boss in the federal prosecution era, and it is not achieved by being passive or reactive. Civella was active, strategic, and politically sophisticated in ways that the public record, filtered largely through FBI surveillance and federal trial transcripts, only partially captures. In practice, running a mob family for 30 years means navigating a specific set of recurring challenges that each require different skills. You manage internal disputes between crews and individuals who have competing interests and competing ambitions. You manage your relationship with a national commission structure, presenting your family's interests and protecting your territory against encroachment from neighboring organizations. You manage the relationship with law enforcement, which is not purely adversarial in the way that outsiders imagine, but involves a constant calculation about which activities to pursue, which to avoid, and how to maintain enough political insulation to continue operating. Civella did all of this for 3 decades without losing control of the organization and without producing the kind of internal implosion that had devastated other mid-sized mob families in the same period. That record is itself evidence of organizational capability that gets underweight in histories that focus on the Las Vegas skim as though it were his entire career. The Kansas City mob under Civella controlled a range of criminal activities: gambling operations, loan sharking, labor union influence, and a specific kind of political corruption that turned Kansas City city government into a resource for the organization rather than a threat to it. This last element, the relationship with local political power, was something Civella managed with particular skill. Kansas City's history of machine politics created an environment where organized crime and official power were not simply parallel structures, but genuinely integrated ones, and Civella understood how to operate within that integration. By the time Las Vegas became the question, Civella had been running this machine for nearly 2 decades. He was not an ambitious outsider trying to break into the casino business. He was an established boss who saw an opportunity that fit naturally within his existing operation and who moved to exploit it with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything else. How Kansas City got into Las Vegas. The Kansas City mob's connection to Las Vegas casinos did not begin with Nick Civella walking into a casino and demanding a piece. It began with the specific social and financial networks that connected Missouri's criminal economy to Nevada's legal gambling industry in the post-war period. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund is where the story starts. The Teamsters Union, under Dave Beck and later Jimmy Hoffa, had accumulated a pension fund that contained hundreds of millions of dollars contributed by union members across the country. That fund was controlled, in practice, by the union's leadership, and the union's leadership was closely connected to organized crime organizations in multiple cities. Kansas City, which had significant Teamsters membership through its trucking and meatpacking industries, was one of those cities. The pension fund became the primary financing mechanism for Las Vegas casino construction and expansion in the 1950s and 1960s. Casino developers who could not get conventional financing from mainstream banks, because the casino industry was still considered disreputable by most financial institutions, could get loans from the Teamsters Fund. The people who made those loans happen were organized crime figures who controlled Teamsters locals or who had relationships with union officials who did. Civella was among those people. His relationships with Teamsters officials gave him and his organization leverage over the pension fund's lending decisions. When a new casino needed construction financing, or when an existing casino needed capital for expansion, the organized crime figures who could influence the fund's lending decisions had real power over who got money and on what terms. This financial leverage was the foundation of the mob's Las Vegas presence, and it predates the skimming operations that the FBI eventually investigated by years. The Kansas City connection to Las Vegas casinos was not an intrusion into someone else's territory. It was a relationship built over time through financial infrastructure that the mob had helped create. The Teamsters connection also created a different kind of leverage than simple financial participation. When you have influence over whether a casino gets its construction loan renewed or whether it can access capital for expansion, you have a relationship with that casino's ownership that is qualitatively different from being an outside criminal trying to break in. The mob's Las Vegas presence was built into the industry's financial architecture from the beginning, which is part of why it took so long to detect and dismantle. Alan Dorfman, who ran the Teamsters Fund's lending operations and who was connected to organized crime figures, including Civella, was the mechanism through which mob influence over pension fund lending was exercised. Dorfman was shot and killed in January 1983, 2 months before Civella's own death, in a killing that federal investigators connected to fears that he was about to cooperate with the government. His death removed a key link in the chain of knowledge about how the pension fund had been used, and it was one of several killings during this period that appeared designed to limit the evidence available to federal prosecutors. By the 1970s, when Civella was at the height of his power, the relationship had evolved from construction, financing into direct operational influence over specific casinos. The Tropicana Hotel and casino became the focal point of Kansas City's Las Vegas interests. The Tropicana and how the skim worked. The Tropicana opened in 1957 and by the 1970s was one of the prominent hotels on the Las Vegas Strip. It was also, according to the federal investigation that eventually documented what was happening there, being systematically skimmed by organized crime figures who had inserted their people into key positions within the casino's operations. The skim is a specific mechanism for stealing from a casino, and understanding how it worked is important to understanding why it was so valuable and why it was so difficult to detect. Casino gambling generates cash in enormous quantities. Slot machines fill up with coins and bills. Table games generate chips that are converted to cash. The casino's accounting systems are designed to track this cash from the moment it enters a machine or crosses a table to the moment it is counted and recorded in the casino's official revenue figures. Nevada's gaming regulations by the 1970s were extensive and specific about how this counting and recording was supposed to happen. The skim exploited the gap between when cash entered the counting room and when it was officially recorded. If you controlled the people in the counting room, or if you controlled the people who supervised the counting room, you could remove cash before it entered the official count. The removed cash never appeared in the revenue figures. It was never taxed. It generated no paper trail. It was simply extracted from the stream of money before the official record began. The people who performed the extraction were casino employees, placed in specific positions by or for the organized crime organizations that had financial interests in the casino. Joseph Agosto, who served as entertainment director at the Tropicana, was one of the key figures in the Kansas City mob's operation at the casino. Carl Thomas was another. These were people whose casino positions gave them access to the counting process and the ability to manage who else had that access. The cash extracted through the skim was couriered out of Nevada to Kansas City, where it entered the mob's financial operations. The specific amounts are difficult to establish precisely from the public record, but the FBI's estimates from the Tropicana operation, based on surveillance and the eventual cooperation of witnesses, placed the total extracted over the period of the operation in the millions of dollars. The couriers who physically moved the cash from Las Vegas to Kansas City were not senior mob figures. They were people whose appearances and travel patterns would not attract attention, whose connection to organized crime was not in any database that airport security or law enforcement was checking. Cash moved in luggage, in clothing, in ways designed to be unremarkable to anyone watching. The specific amounts moved on any given trip were calibrated to stay beneath the thresholds that would trigger scrutiny, and the frequency of trips was managed to avoid the kind of pattern recognition that sustained observation might produce. Joseph Agosto, the Tropicana figure at the center of the Kansas City operation, eventually became a key government witness. His decision to cooperate with the FBI gave investigators the internal account of the skim's mechanics that external surveillance and financial analysis alone could not have produced. He died of a heart attack in 1983 before testifying at trial, but the information he had provided to investigators contributed to the evidentiary foundation of the Operation Strawman prosecutions. All of this was coordinated and directed from Kansas City by Nick Civella. He never saw it happen. He never touched the money in Nevada. He received his share through intermediaries after the cash had traveled the distance from Las Vegas to Missouri. The operation worked because the people he had placed inside the Tropicana were competent, the logistical chain was reliable, and the Nevada gaming regulators for a significant period were not looking in the right direction. The Black Book and what it actually meant. When Nevada added Nick Civella to the Black Book in 1978, the Gaming Control Board was making a public declaration of what federal investigators have been documenting for years. That Civella was a serious organized crime figure whose presence in or around Nevada casinos was incompatible with the regulated gambling industry the state was trying to maintain. The Black Book exclusion was, from a legal standpoint, a civil regulatory action rather than a criminal prosecution. It required Civella to stay out of Nevada casinos. It did not prevent him from communicating with people who worked in Nevada casinos. It did not prevent people who worked in Nevada casinos from bringing him information or money. It did not prevent him from making decisions about Nevada casino operations from his home in Kansas City. This is the specific irony that the story of Civella's post-Black Book career illustrates with unusual clarity. The tool designed to remove him from the casino industry removed him physically without removing him operationally. The skim at the Tropicana continued after his name went in the Black Book. The money continued to flow to Kansas City. The intermediaries continued to perform their functions. Civella's ability to direct the operation was not meaningfully impaired by the fact that he could no longer walk through the casino's front door. The Black Book designation did have one significant effect that its architects probably intended. It created a bright legal line that, when the FBI eventually built its case, made certain elements of the prosecution cleaner. Civella was not just someone who had organized crime connections to a casino. He was someone who was legally excluded from casinos and who had organized crime connections to a casino anyway. The exclusion turned a regulatory violation into part of the factual foundation for a criminal conspiracy charge. The FBI's Operation Strawman, which was the investigation that eventually produced the prosecutions of Civella and others connected to the Las Vegas skim operations, spent years documenting the gap between the Black Book exclusion and the operational reality. The gap was wide and well documented by the time the indictments came. What Civella actually controlled. The brief for this video refers to Civella controlling 4 casinos simultaneously, and this claim requires some careful unpacking against what the investigative record actually supports. The Kansas City mob's primary Las Vegas interest was the Tropicana. This is documented thoroughly in the federal prosecution records and is not in dispute. Beyond the Tropicana, the broader picture of mob casino involvement in Las Vegas during this period is more complicated because the different organized crime families that had Las Vegas interests operated those interests in overlapping and interconnected ways. The Chicago outfit, which was the dominant force in Las Vegas mob activity during this period, had interests in the Stardust, the Fremont, the Marina, and the Hacienda casinos. These operations were connected through shared financial and operational infrastructure with the Kansas City family's Tropicana interests. Whether Civella personally directed operations at multiple casinos, or whether his organizational relationship with Chicago meant that Kansas City received financial benefits from Chicago-directed operations at other casinos, is a distinction the public record does not resolve with complete precision. What is clear is that the Kansas City family had financial interests that extended beyond a single casino, and that Civella's organizational relationships with Chicago mob leadership gave him influence over a broader Las Vegas operation than a simple single casino picture suggests. The FBI's investigation documented a network of mob interests in Las Vegas that involved multiple families, multiple casinos, and multiple layers of coordination between them. Kansas City's position in that network was real and financially significant. The specific scope of Civella's direct operational control versus his financial participation in a broader shared operation is something the investigative record supports in general terms without resolving in every particular. What is not in question is that Kansas City's share of the Las Vegas skim represented genuine and substantial income for the Civella organization across a period of years, and that this income derived from criminal operations in a regulated industry that Nevada regulators and the FBI eventually documented with considerable thoroughness. How Casino handled Kansas City. Martin Scorsese's Casino is a film built around specific characters who represent specific real people, with enough composite and fictional elements to provide legal cover while remaining recognizably connected to actual events. The Kansas City mob and casino is represented primarily through the characters who receive money from Las Vegas and who control the Las Vegas operations from a distance. The Kansas City bosses appear in meeting scenes and in phone conversations, but the film's dramatic weight is concentrated in Las Vegas itself. Sam Rothstein, Frank Rosenthal, Nicky Santoro, Tony Spilotro, and Ginger McKenna, Jerry McGee. This structure reflects the film's narrative priorities, which follow Rosenthal's story. Rosenthal was in Las Vegas. His relationship with Spilotro was in Las Vegas. His relationship with Ginger was in Las Vegas. The Kansas City bosses who controlled his position existed in Rosenthal's daily life, as a source of authority that communicated through intermediaries and whose decisions shaped his world without their physical presence being constant. The film captures this accurately in structural terms. Kansas City in Casino functions as a remote authority whose decisions constrain what the Las Vegas characters can do, in the same way that Civella in Kansas City functioned as a remote authority in the actual operation. What the film does not give you is any sense of who Nick Civella actually was, what he had built before Las Vegas became part of the story, or the specific ingenuity of an operation in which a man band from Nevada managed to run Nevada casinos for years without anyone stopping him. The Kansas City characters in Casino are defined entirely by their relationship to Las Vegas. The real Civella was defined by 30 years of running a major American organized crime organization, of which Las Vegas was a significant but not solitary element. The film also does not give you the specific quality of patience and indirection that characterize Civella's operation. The mob bosses in Casino argue loudly, make decisions impulsively, and eventually bring the entire operation down through their own internal dysfunction. Civella's actual operation was considerably more disciplined than this depiction suggests. It ran for years without serious interruption. The people he placed inside the Tropicana performed their functions consistently. The couriers moved the money reliably. The breakdown came not from internal dysfunction, but from sustained federal investigation that eventually placed enough surveillance on enough people to document what was happening. The FBI comes for the skim. The investigation that became Operation Strawman began accumulating evidence in the mid-1970s and built through the late 1970s into a documented picture of mob control over multiple Las Vegas casinos. The FBI's approach to this investigation reflected the specific lessons the Bureau had learned from years of trying to prosecute organized crime through conventional methods. Surveillance was extensive. Electronic monitoring of mob figures' communications produced thousands of hours of recorded conversation. Informants developed inside the Las Vegas casino operations provided accounts of how the skim actually worked at the operational level. Financial analysis traced money flows from Nevada to the Midwest. The specific conversations that were eventually used in the prosecutions included Civella discussing the Las Vegas operation with other mob figures in Kansas City. These recordings, captured through surveillance equipment placed in locations where mob discussions were known to take place, provided direct evidence of his coordination of the Tropicana skim despite his physical absence from Nevada. Carl DeLuna, Civella's underboss, was a central figure in the prosecution. His conversations about the Las Vegas operation, captured in FBI surveillance, were among the most directly incriminating evidence the government assembled. DeLuna was convicted. Carl Thomas, the Tropicana figure whose role in the skim was documented through both surveillance and the accounts of cooperating witnesses, was also prosecuted. The prosecutorial strategy used RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allowed prosecutors to connect individual criminal acts into a pattern of organized criminal enterprise. RICO transformed what might have been a series of individual theft cases into a single conspiracy prosecution that encompassed the full scope of the operation across years of criminal activity. Civella was indicted in 1983 as part of the Operation Strawman prosecutions. He was in poor health by this point, suffering from cancer that had been diagnosed during the investigation's final stages. The federal case against him was solid. The surveillance evidence was extensive. The cooperating witnesses were credible. The financial documentation was thorough. The evidence accumulated during Operation Strawman represented one of the most comprehensive pictures of mob casino operations ever assembled by federal investigators. It documented the skim mechanics in detail, traced the flow of money from casino counting rooms through courier networks to organized crime figures in multiple cities, and established the decision-making authority of specific mob bosses over specific casino operations. The investigation did not simply establish that organized crime had money in Las Vegas casinos. It established who made specific decisions, who gave specific orders, who received specific payments, and how all of these elements connected into a coordinated criminal enterprise that had been running for years. He died on March 12, 1983, before the case went to trial. He was 70 years old. His death came while he was under house arrest, still awaiting trial for the conspiracy that his organization had spent years executing from a city 800 miles from the casinos it was stealing from. Carl DeLuna, who had been Civella's underboss and the primary operational coordinator of the Kansas City mob's Las Vegas activities, was convicted. He received a 4-year federal prison sentence. The conviction did not produce a windfall of new information for federal investigators because DeLuna maintained the discipline that characterized the Civella organization. He did not cooperate. He served his sentence. The specific texture of how the operation worked at its most operational level, the day-to-day decisions, and the specific conversations that produced them, went largely undocumented because the people who knew it best chose silence over any available alternative. What made Civella different? The specific quality that distinguished Nick Civella from the average mob boss of his era was operational patience combined with a genuine understanding of how legitimate economic systems worked and how they could be exploited. Most mob bosses understood violence as a management tool and understood the social architecture of criminal organizations. Fewer understood the specific mechanics of regulated industries and how criminal operations could be inserted into those mechanics without immediate detection. Civella understood regulated industries. His 30 years of running the Kansas City organization had given him practical experience with how legitimate businesses, labor unions, and government institutions actually functioned, and how the gaps in those systems' oversight could be exploited by people willing to be patient and methodical. The Las Vegas operation demonstrated this understanding clearly. The skim worked because Civella had identified the specific point in the casino's revenue processing where oversight was weakest, had placed the right people at that point, and had built a reliable logistics chain for moving the extracted cash across state lines. Each of these elements required specific knowledge of how casinos process cash, of who could be trusted with positions inside that process, of how money could be moved without generating the kind of financial trail that federal investigators could follow. He assembled this operation from 800 miles away, while being banned from the state where the casinos operated, without ever being present for any of the operational decisions that the people on the ground had to make in real time. This required not just planning, but the specific kind of trust in his intermediaries that only comes from years of cultivating relationships with people whose reliability he had tested across many situations. The FBI took years to build its case against him. That timeline is itself evidence of how well-constructed the operation was. The agency was not slow or incompetent in its investigation. It was thorough and methodical. The operation it was investigating was also thorough and methodical, and the gap between federal surveillance capabilities and the operational security of Civella's organization was narrow enough that it took sustained investment across multiple years to close it. Compare this to Tony Spilatro's Las Vegas operation, which was generating FBI attention almost immediately through visible excess, public confrontations, and the specific quality of chaos that follows from someone operating without institutional discipline. Spilatro was in the FBI's files early and stayed there. Civella ran his operation for years before the federal investigation had assembled enough to move toward prosecution. The contrast is instructive about the difference between criminal organizations that are built around personalities and criminal organizations that are built around systems. What Kansas City lost when he died? Nick Civella's death in March 1983 removed from the Kansas City organization the specific combination of leadership qualities that had made it function effectively for 30 years. His brother Carl Civella and other family members continued to lead the organization after his death, but the quality of sustained, patient, long-term strategic thinking that Nick had brought was not easily replaced. The Kansas City family's Las Vegas operations, already under severe federal pressure from the Operation Strawman prosecutions, did not survive the combination of his death and the subsequent convictions of key figures in the skim operation. Carl DeLuna's conviction in 1983 removed the underboss. The Tropicana's mob-connected management was dismantled as the Nevada Gaming Control Board, energized by the FBI's documentation of what had been happening, moved aggressively to clean up the casino's operations. The network that had extracted millions of dollars from a Las Vegas casino over nearly a decade was effectively destroyed within a few years of Civella's death. The broader Operation Strawman prosecutions, which extended to Chicago figures and others involved in the multi-casino skim operations, produced convictions across the mid-1980s that significantly weakened organized crime's Las Vegas presence. The regulatory and law enforcement response to what the investigations had revealed included substantial strengthening of Nevada's casino oversight mechanisms, making it considerably harder for the kind of counting room manipulation that the skim had depended on to operate undetected. Las Vegas in the late 1980s and 1990s was a different place from Las Vegas in the 1970s, and the change was partly a direct consequence of what Nick Civella's organization had done and what the federal investigation of that operation had revealed. Resolution. Nick Civella was banned from Nevada in 1978. He ran Nevada casino operations from Kansas City for years after that ban. He died before he could be tried for it. The record he left behind is not primarily a story about Las Vegas or about casino heists or about the glamorous surface of mob involvement in the gambling industry. It is a story about organizational capability, how you build an operation that can extract value from a regulated industry across hundreds of miles through multiple layers of intermediaries over an extended period in ways that take the government years to fully document. Casino the film gave you a story about Las Vegas and the people who ran it on the ground. It gave you Rothstein's management genius, Spilatro's violence, the Strip's visual excess. It gave you Kansas City as a shadowy presence making demand from a distance. What the film could not give you, because it was not the story the film was built to tell, was the man in Kansas City who made all of that possible. Nick Civella spent 30 years building an organization capable of reaching into Nevada's casino industry from 800 miles away. He did it carefully, patiently, and with a sophistication that neither Nevada regulators nor FBI investigators were positioned to understand until the damage was already done. He was in the Black Book. The Black Book did not stop him. It took a decade of federal investigation, the cooperation of insiders, thousands of hours of surveillance recordings, and a RICO prosecution to stop him. And even then, the prosecution ran out of time before the trial could start. He died at home. The FBI's case against him died with him. His organization did not survive him by much. The casinos are still there, rebuilt and corporatized in ways that would make the counting room skim Civella ran essentially impossible to execute today. The money he took from them never came back. The federal case built against him ran out of time. His organization did not survive him by much. But for the better part of a decade, a man who was banned from Nevada ran Nevada casinos from 800 miles away, and the record he left behind is a more complete picture of what organized crime capability actually looks like than any film has managed to fully capture.